Hello, my dear students. Today we are going to study on MTP 202, Unit 5, Folding. In the previous unit, you had learned about different techniques of tie and dye. That was binding. In this unit, we are going to learn about another very interesting technique, that is folding. Objectives. After going through this lesson, you will gain an understanding about different methods of folding, the fabric for tie and dye, understand various effects acquired with folding of the fabric. Introduction. Making striking patterns and effects, especially stripes, are produced by the folding techniques, combined with binding. To get the best results, this method calls for a very accurate workmanship. Generally speaking, very narrow stripes should be confined to the finer fabrics, but mostly coarser kind of material can be used for medium to wider stripes. Cotton threads are suitable for binding fine cloth, but a stronger thread or string is preferable for coarser material of wider stripes. A bulky tied-up sample should be left longer in the dye bath so that the dye can penetrate to the inner folds. Types of folding. There are 4 main categories that come under this heading: simple stripe, an individual or edge stripe; third, folded squares; and fourth, rope tying. Before I continue explaining you these, let me tell you a small little tip. To get beautiful designs and perfect lines, it's extremely important that when we fold our fabric, the folding has to be perfect. There should not be a slightest difference between the first and the second fold. Simple stripes. This is the first one. This is a quick and easy way to dye stripes on a length of cloth to use as a background for prints, stencils, embroidery, etc., or as the first stage of a tie-dye design where a pattern of a more precise nature is to be superimposed. The second type is resist stripe. Fold the fabric in half in the direction of the stripe, making pleats at right angle to the first fold. Tie the thread of binding round the bundle. Dye. During the process of dyeing, open out the pleats to allow the dye to reach into the inner folds. This applies to all the folding methods. Rinse and dry. Add more binding before dyeing a second color. Rinse, dry, and untie. on one side of a binding can be dyed a different color from those on the other side. Slightly different stripes are made if the binding completely encloses one end of the bundle. Add more binding when dyeing a second color. Another method of simple stripe is resist stripe. Fold the cloth in half in the direction of the proposed stripes. Turn each side back again to the middle so that there are 4 thicknesses of the cloth. Make the folded cloth into a series according to the pleats across and at right angles to the previous one. Bind round the bundle. Dye the fabric. From this, it will be apparent that the number of times the sample is folded in the first place determines the number of resist stripes produced. The next of simple stripe is larger number of stripes. Rule a line for the middle of each stripe and crease. Fold the creased edges together, making perfect pleats. Make another set of pleats at right angles to the first one. Bind the middle of the bundle and dye, opening out the folds so that the dye can penetrate right up to the binding. Leave longer in the dye bath. Rinse and dry. Add more binding when dyeing a second or third color. Dye the tips of the folded edges into another color if necessary. Rinse, dry, and untie. Remove the binding. Make a fresh binding at right angles down the bundle. Dye a second color. Rinse, dry, and untie. Now I am going to ask you some self-check questions. I'm sure you will be able to answer them because they are extremely simple and to the point. What are the various categories that come under folding technique? I repeat question number 1. What are the various categories that come under folding technique? Question number 2. How are simple stripes produced? Question number 3. How large a number of stripes, patterns produced? If you have answered these, let us continue. An individual or edge stripe. In this method, a simple stripe, narrow or wider and of more than one color, can be dyed on the length of cloth or a number of stripes, similar or dissimilar, can be dyed separately on a sample. After dyeing a series of parallel stripes in one direction, a second layer can be made at right angles to the first to form a plaid or trellis effect. Dyeing a simple edge stripe. Rule a line on the cloth to indicate the center of the stripe and make a fold along it. Beginning at the right hand side, crease this folded edge into small zigzag pleats with the thumb and forefinger. Keep the top edge in perfect level. There should now be a bundle of perfect pleats. Place a firm line of binding round the bundle at a distance from the edge equal to half the width of the proposed stripe. Invert the edges of the pleated bundle into a shallow bowl containing just enough dye to reach up as far as the binding is there. To ensure that the dye rises as far as the binding throughout the mass of pleats, gently open out the folds near the center. The dye should not be allowed to spread to the cloth beyond the binding. If rubber gloves are worn, it is possible to extract the surplus dye by squeezing or pressing the dye area of the sample against the side of the bowl. Rinse the small dyed area immediately and squeeze in a piece of old clean rag or newspaper to absorb the excess moisture. For the second color, add more binding near the edge and dye in the same way as the first. The extreme edges can be dyed a third color either by pressing them on a cloth impregnated with dye or by applying the dye with the brush. After dyeing the edges of the pleats, they can be dipped in the bleach so that the excess color is removed. Rinse thoroughly before and after untying. Wax may be painted on the tips of the pleats before the first or the second dye to get another kind of an effect. Rinse, dry, and untie. Now I am going to tell you how to make several stripes. When several stripes are planned, mark their positions on the cloth. Then proceed. Each stripe should be pleated, bound, and dyed separately. After completing a stripe, wrap some old cloth around it while working on the next one. This prevents any loose dye from entering the rest of the sample. Where very fine cloth is being used, several stripes can be folded together after the initial creases have been made. Pin or tack to keep the place. Then pleat the groups of folds as one. This needs careful handling, as the pleating must be accurate and perfect, and all the top edges kept in a perfect sync. Dye each group individually as one stripe. If the stripes are very close together and must be folded and dyed separately, it must be difficult to carry out the zigzag pleating, as there will be insufficient cloth in between each stripe. In this case, work in 2 stages: rinse, dry, and untie. Now pleat and dye the stripe that were omitted before. So far, the instructions given produce dyed stripes on an undyed background. To dye the whole sample, apply a solid binding to each bundle of pleats so that the previously dyed area is completely covered. This will reserve the colors dyed on the folded edges. The entire sample can be immersed in the dye bath, dyeing the same or a different color. Now, this is your third method, and that is folded squares. There are innumerable ways of folding, binding, and dyeing a square of cloth, each giving interesting results. The squares may be large or small, but for the first experiment, one approximately 8" by 8" is a suitable size. The method for doing this would be fold the fabric into 4, then again diagonally, so that a triangle is formed. Finally, add binding to the corners or at convenient spots. Dye, rinse and dry. Before dyeing a second or third color, rearrange the binding, rinse, dry and untie. To add variety and an extra color, dye part of the square before folding. one special way of folding a square that gives such pleasing results that it is worth singling out. The effect produced is a series of dyed squares, one within the other. Take a square cloth of any size, A, B, C, D. Center O, fold it diagonally so that A coincides with C. Make a crease. Similarly, folding B over diagonally so that it coincides with D. Crease and fold. Bring corners A and D together and B to C. All the outer edges of the square are long in the line AB. Mark X midway along AB. Make a series of zigzag pleats along AB so that both A and B almost meet at X. The square is now pleated into two columns, one on either side of OX. It is important that all the edges should be level between A, X and B. Fold the sample outwards from O to X. Place a line of binding near the lower edges parallel to AXB, which means that the binding is in line with the grain or weave of the cloth. Make several other bindings further up towards O, parallel to the first binding. A small area near O may be enclosed with the lattice binding. Leave longer in the dye bath so that the dye can penetrate into the central folds. Rinse and dry. Add more binding before dyeing a second or third color. Rinse, dry and untie. The central point O can be dipped in bleach or a different colored dye. The lower edges AXB may be dyed a much darker color than the rest of the sample. Now this is the fourth type of dyeing, that is rope dyeing. This gives a trellis effect. This particular type or style of tie and dye is found in West Africa generally. Narrow stripes of cloth are used so that the dye can penetrate into the closely packed folds. When these stripes cloth are folded and bound, they resemble ropes, hence the name. Where the cloth is fine, a wider piece can be treated successfully by this method. The pattern produced is one of stripes or bands of texture. Whenever the rope is extra bulky, allow a larger dyeing tin. If several colors are planned, try to arrange the first binding at least 1 to 2 inches apart to enable the first dyeing to penetrate up to the binding even on the inner folds. Method: take a ruler and rule a series of parallel lines following the warp or weft approximately 1 inch apart or the width of the ruler. Make a crease along each line. Fold all the creases, edges together very accurately. This process is made easier if an iron can be used and a few pins inserted at intervals or a quick loose binding made to hold the pleats in place. Make blocks or lines of binding to form a resist stripe, the unbound areas produced by the dyed stripes. Lattice binding gives bands of textures. The binding should be made at right angles to the folded edges of the cloth. These stripes produced is also at right angles to the folded edges or the lines that were ruled in the first place. Dye, rinse and dry. Make arrangements to the binding before dyeing a second or third color. Rinse, dry and untie. This is a variation of rope technique, the main difference being the manner in which the material is folded. The pleats are made diagonally across the cloth instead of the following the warp or weft as explained earlier. The stripes which are produced at right angles to these pleats are therefore dyed diagonally on the sample. Narrow or wide, fine to medium weight material can be used for this method. Technique. Rule parallel lines over the cloth approximately 1 inch apart, beginning at corner X. If the sample is large, rule the lines further apart or crease alternate lines for the edges so that perfect pleats can be made. The angles at which the parallel lines are drawn determines the direction of the finished dyed stripes. For example, lines drawn at an angle of 45 degrees will produce stripes at 45 degrees. Lines at an angle of approximately 30 degrees will give finished stripes at an angle of 60 degrees and vice versa. Make a crease along each line and fold these together until the entire sample is arranged into perfect pleats, running diagonally on the sample. During this operation, it is helpful to use an iron and insert pins to hold the pleats in place. Bind the area which are to be reserved from the dye. Make these binding at right angle to the folded edges or pencil lines. Dye, rinse and dry. Rearrange or add to the bindings before dyeing a second or third color. Rinse, dry and untie. Tying. This is your fourth style, and this is going to give you the trellis effect. This is a sequel and is carried out in two definite stages. First, mark out the sample in diagonal lines, beginning at the corner X. Crease, fold into perfect pleats, bind, dye, rinse and dry as described earlier, untie and iron out the creases. Second, stage 2 is a repetition of the first, except that the parallel lines are ruled from corner B instead of X. This means that they are at right angle to the previous set of lines. Crease and fold into pleats, bind, dye, rinse, dry and untie. More than one color can be dyed at each stage if the binding are adjusted. Both stages can be dyed similarly or in contrasting colors. To obtain a regular trellis effect, both sets of lines should be ruled at the same angle and at the same distance apart. A square of cloth dyed with this technique is most attractive. Rule the lines at an angle of 45 degrees from the corner X. Crease, fold into pleats. Fold the pleated sample in half to bind. Leave the fold unbound. Dye as required. Rinse, dry, untie and iron. If a trellis effect is desired, repeat the whole process beginning at the corner. To give a zigzag stripe effect in the rope technique, the following method would be used. This is another development of the diagonal rope technique. The main difference being that the cloth is folded lengthwise before the parallel lines are ruled. Although size is no obstacle, the coarser grained cloth are much more unsuitable. Method: a single zigzag. Fold the material in half lengthwise, pin or tack the selvage together. Work on the double cloth as if it were single. Mark parallel diagonal lines from one corner and crease them. Fold into perfect pleats. Bind. Dye, rinse and dry as described for diagonal stripes. Add further binding for a second or third color. rinse, dry, and untie. For making several zigzags, the following method would be required. If 2 zigzags are required, fold cloth in half lengthwise, then turn each salvage edges back to the center fold, giving 4 thicknesses of material. From this point, work in exactly the same manner as for the single zigzag. When 3 zigzags are required, make 3 double pleats lengthwise down the cloth, giving 6 thicknesses of material. For 4 zigzags, 4 double pleats and 8 thicknesses of material, and so on. Continue as described for a single zigzag. Folding the cloth lengthwise produces zigzags running across the fabric. If the first folds are made across the sample, the zigzag stripe will be dyed lengthwise on the cloth. To cut down the binding in any of the diagonal stripe techniques, especially where there is a long thin sample, work as follows. Bind a small area in the center of the rope singly. Bring the 2 ends together and bind as one unit. Summing up, today you were told about the simple stripe, an individual or edge stripe, folded square, and rope tying. One of the ways of continuing with any of these different techniques was told to you that while folding a fabric, perfect precision has to be there where the folds are. Not a slightest of difference has to be there between the first and the second fold. If we stick to that, we have perfect lines, squares, angles, etc. Otherwise, this will not be achieved. While doing the tie and dye to the fabric or garment or fold it into a variety of patterns and bound, the folds and the binds do not only make patterns, but they guide the dyer in applying various colors to the dye. While tie and dyeing, the use of folding technique is important because the way you fold the fabric determines the kind of pattern you will have. There are many different tie and dye folding techniques, and each offers a unique design. Thank you.